Welcome to Exploring the Question, brought to you by the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. I'm your host, Cleves Whitney, Executive Director of the Foundation. Now, we all know that being the President of the United States is an arduous and often thankless task. In today's episode, we want to look at one of the most besieged presidents ever to inhabit the White House, Herbert Hoover. How did our nation's 31st president succeed in carrying out all of his constitutional and administrative duties in the midst of the worst economic depression in U.S. history? You know, it's a timely topic to explore when there's so much talk these days about the world tumbling into an economic recession. Well, joining me to find valuable historical grist for our civic mill is Dr. George Nash, a Harvard-educated historian who has written extensively on Herbert Hoover, the post-war conservative movement in America, and current affairs. Thank you, George, for exploring some questions with me today.
Good to see you, Cleves. Good to be with you today. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's start with the most basic question of all. For all of our audience who may not know much about him, who was Herbert Hoover?
Well, Herbert Hoover was an American mining engineer, statesman, president of the United States. He was born in 1874, died in 1964. He lived longer as an ex-president than any other ex-president until Jimmy Carter, who now holds that record. Hoover was born in a little town or village, really, of West Branch, Iowa. His father was a blacksmith. It was really a prairie town on the frontier in Iowa at that time. And Hoover was one of three children. He was orphaned before he was 10 years old and went out to live eventually with a maternal uncle in Oregon, where he achieved no more than a middle school education. Then became kind of the office boy to his uncle, and in his what would have been high school years, took some night courses, but had no systematic high school level education. He was nevertheless admitted to Stanford University as a member of its founding four-year class. That was in 1891. And as the story is told, and I believe it's true, Hoover had to do some entrance exams up in Oregon with a visiting professor from the new or soon to be university, Stanford, overseeing his study or his test, so to speak. And he noticed that Hoover was gritting his teeth through a geometry problem, something he had never really studied at an advanced level. And so the professor saw something in that boy, some determination, some strength of character, some strength of will, determination to get an education. And so Hoover was admitted conditionally to Stanford, conditionally on his passing more entrance exams just before school opened 3 months later. So he went down to Palo Alto and spent a month being tutored by a couple of young women who did that sort of thing, tutoring. And he was admitted, passed sufficiently that he was admitted into the first pioneer class, as it was called, at Stanford. From there, he graduated from college, went into a career of mining engineering, became internationally famous, a rather wealthy man by the time he was 40. Served in humanitarian work, and I can elaborate further if you want, did humanitarian work for the relief of Belgium when it was under German occupation in World War I. And that fed the entire civilian population of Belgium, over 7 million people. Put Hoover on the world stage. He came back to the United States, high in the esteem of the American people, became Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, and in 1928 ran for president without ever having held an elective public office. So his career really was curving unbrokenly upward, except for the boyhood tragedy, you might say, of losing both of his parents before he was 10. And he was of Quaker background, Quaker upbringing, and I think that has some importance. And also, I think that the experience of orphanhood and living really with a maternal uncle who was a good man, but rather sober, maybe a bit stern, a medical doctor who I think meant well, but Hoover always felt a bit, I think, of an outsider. And that I think all that imbued in him a determination to make his way in the world and make his mark upon the world. He once said to his White House press secretary years later that his first goal in life was to be dependent on no one. And he achieved that kind of independence in a financial way as a comparatively young man. But having done well in worldly monetary terms, he turned on the cusp of middle age to a career of doing good. And that career he thought would take the form of becoming a newspaper owner in California and trying to uplift and educate the enlightened and enlighten the citizenry. Well, World War I broke out while Hoover was still in London, working more or less to cash in, you might say, on his mining career and return to the States. Well, his career took a totally different path, and he started doing good, so to speak, by becoming the administrator of humanitarian relief on an unprecedented scale. I have to emphasize really what he did in Belgium, the feeding of an entire civilian population under enemy army occupation in the middle of a war that was still raging, that had never been done in the history of the world. And so Hoover became known as the Napoleon of mercy, the master of emergencies. Eventually, he got the epithet, acquired it from some of his loyal fans, the great humanitarian. This figure who was successful on many levels, but who always had that urge to give back as well as to make a fortune. When he was still in his 30s, he said, anyone who hasn't made $1 million by the time he's a fortune by the time he's 40 isn't worth much. And that was Hoover, the driving, young, hard-charging go-getter, going up the ladder. But having gotten there, he said to his friends, just making money isn't enough. So he turned from the world of business and rather accidentally into the world of a new kind of occupation, a professional humanitarian relief worker and saver of millions of lives, and then a more conventional position as Secretary of Commerce in a cabinet of 2 presidents. And then he went for the great prize, the presidency. And after the presidency, he lived a very long and productive life. So for me as a biographer, that's a quick summary of some of the highlights of who Herbert Hoover was.
Oh my gosh, George, that's a remarkable story of individual strength and a commitment to service. And you alluded to some of the sources of that service, his family, his Quaker background. But really, there must have been something unique in there. I mean, I remember from one of our previous conversations, and when you were here in Grand Rapids previously, you said something remarkable, and you could elaborate on this. Let's go more into his humanitarian service. I think you said he fed something like 80 million human beings?
Yes. Again, it began with his becoming chairman of an organization he founded called the Commission for Relief in Belgium in 1914. Belgium was caught between the British blockade and the German army of occupation. It was a net food importing country, so it had to get food from the outside world. And Hoover negotiated with the Germans and the British so that a neutral, namely Hoover, from the United States, which was not yet at war, Hoover organized this. And it's a complicated and remarkable story in its own right, but that set him, as he put, on the slippery slope of public life. Now, he came back in 1917 to America. He continued on to run the Belgian relief from afar, oversee it, but he entered the Wilson administration as food administrator, a temporary wartime job. And that was an effort to bring about food conservation by the American people, conserve food so that we would have a surplus to send to our beleaguered allies. So he was a success at that. And then when the war ended in November of 1918, the First World War, Hoover was sent by President Wilson to Europe, back to Europe, to become really the Director General of American relief efforts for as many as 20 countries, all sorts of countries, including brand new countries like Czechoslovakia and the reconstituted Poland as an independent country. All over the place in Eastern Europe and Central Europe in particular, there were mammoth food shortages, social disorganization, the threat of communist revolution. It was almost anarchic at times. And Hoover organized this extraordinary food relief operation to bring food into those countries, to give it to the children, to the civilians, and to stabilize economies and populations and hopefully get people back on a peaceful track. All of that involved feeding of millions of people. And one last component of this that perhaps the audience will not know, between 1921 and 1923, Hoover in Washington administered from afar a special relief effort to deal with the famine in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution and an ensuing drought and dislocation of crops and so forth. There are many causes to that enormous tragedy. This was the greatest famine in Europe, he said, since the Middle Ages. And indeed, it is thought that 5 million Russians, as many as 5 million Russians, died before any food relief from the outside world could come in. And the communist government was so desperate that they appealed to the outside world for assistance. And Hoover, of course, having just been on the world stage as an organizer of all sorts of food and relief efforts across Europe, was the candidate that was really the person to turn to. I don't think they wanted him very much because they knew he was an anti-communist, and Lenin really hated Hoover and was suspicious that Hoover was trying to undermine the regime by sending in relief workers whom Lenin thought might be spies and, you know, provocateurs and so forth. But here's the remarkable thing: we were not yet in a Cold War with the Russian Soviet Empire that was then building, and we were no friends of their ideology and so forth. Nevertheless, Hoover organized a relief effort that brought in, I don't recall the precise figure, I think several 100,000 tons of food that was distributed in the Volga River region primarily. That was the epicenter of this mammoth drought. Now, I said that millions died before that food could even get there. Transporting it across Russia without train service and all the rest was a terrific challenge. But Hoover's efforts fed upwards of 10 million people a day and mostly in 1922. Fantastic numbers. And millions died before the food could get there, but millions of lives were saved. So what I tried to do at one point in my research was to try to come up with some rough figure of how many people were fed by these Hoover food relief expeditions, efforts, like starting with Belgium. You can be pretty clear about Belgium. They had 7 million people, and then you can add on other countries that received similar massive amounts after the war. And then you add up, some people think as many as 18 million or 20 million Russians in all received food at some point from Hoover's relief. So a possibly conservative calculation, it has to be an estimate, no specific figures were kept. We know how much food went in, we just don't know how many mouths were fed, but you can make certain calculations, and there were certain attempts to keep track of how many children were fed. At one point, over 2 million European children were being fed a day. This is after the war. Add up all those figures, and I think something in the neighborhood of 80 million would be accurate, if not precise. And it might be more than that, might be a little less, but someone said, thinking about those figures, I don't know who said it some years ago, that Hoover was responsible for saving more lives than any other person in history. Now, those are not only his own programs, but those that he facilitated, like the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, the Joint Distribution Committee of the Jewish community, and others, that he helped them find the food that they sent in, or helped facilitate transportation. So the way I put it as a historian is, if you look at the programs that he directed, assisted, facilitated, a possibly conservative estimate that at least 80 million people in many countries, Austria, Poland, Hungary, Armenia, and several others, and of course, notably and most dramatically, Russia, that those many lives were saved. And the Russian part of it is virtually unknown to the American people, I think, to this day. Some of the other earlier parts are known, if perhaps vaguely, but thankfully there is a Hoover Institution at Stanford and a Hoover Presidential Library and Museum at his birthplace in Iowa, where this story is told. And visitors to those places learn something about this remarkable achievement, which really was, without which he would never have been president of the United States.
George, what strikes me when you recite the figures, the administrative genius that this man must have possessed is just something to behold. When did Herbert Hoover himself discover that he had this administrative genius, this capacity to move food, goods around the world so expeditiously and save lives?
Well, I would say he recognized that he had ability in this area quite early. Not long after he graduated from Stanford, he became an assistant to an eminent San Francisco mining engineer who sent him out scouting around for inspecting mine propositions. That man helped Hoover obtain a similar position in with a British mining engineering firm that sent Hoover to Australia when Hoover was not yet 23. Well, before he left Australia in 1898 to go to China, his next step up the ladder, he became superintendent of a gold mine. And it is a gold mine that in a somewhat different form still exists. It was one of the remarkable mining ventures in Australian history. And here's Hoover before the age of 24, running a mine with a lot of, rough and ready mining types in the outback of Western Australia. So he knew he had ability to manage people and organize things. And that ability served him very well as he moved ultimately to becoming a partner in the firm that had hired him as a lowly employee, and then on his own. And he had a kind of an informal team or network of mostly American associates for several years before World War I, became known as a kind of an engineer financier because he was very good at developing the plans for launching a company, raising the capital, and then sending experts in to assess the land and organize ultimately the mines. And he realized that he had that ability, and then it showed in one other way that I think is important as we go through the Hoover story. When the war broke out in London in 1914, Hoover was in London, almost 40, turned 40 in August of that very month that the war started. And he was already planning to go back to the States and start a career of some kind in public services, we discussed. There were about 100,000 American tourists on the continent of Europe when the war broke out in August of 1914. And they were in the way and they were panicky. They needed to get out of the way of the German and French armies and all of that happening. So they made their way to London in great numbers. And of course, many of them had no particular funds. They had traveler's checks, but the banks were for a few days closed. You couldn't even cash a traveler's check. Well, Hoover and some other leading American residents of London organized an ad hoc committee to provide assistance to these travelers, find housing for them, maybe loan them some money, etc. I won't go into all sorts of extraneous detail, but this greatly impressed the American ambassador to Great Britain. And so when a few weeks later, the increasingly beleaguered population of Brussels sent over some people to London, hoping that they could locate some food shipments because the Germans had closed in and occupied virtually all of Belgium by that point. And Brussels, the biggest city in the country, was facing famine conditions. It was going to run out of food. So they went over to London looking, and the American ambassador noticed that Hoover had just proven himself fantastically in this relief of his fellow Americans, over 100,000 refugees who were successfully repatriated home. So Hoover was in the right place at the right time. And so he was, again, there were details of the story, but the overriding outcome was that under the patronage of the American ambassador to Great Britain, Hoover launched what was thought would be a kind of ad hoc temporary provision of food to the Belgians until the war ended. And the Kaiser had predicted, by the way, that the war would be over before the leaves fell. Well, that was terribly wrong. But it was then thought that maybe in early 1915, they'll have some more battles and one side or the other would win, and then they'd all get back to normal. Well, Hoover had no idea that this was going to turn into an operation that lasted 4 years and spent close to $1 billion in that era's money. And Hoover was the organizer of it and the leader of it. So that demonstrated executive ability to be able to do all the many different things: publicity, lining up the finance, selecting the personnel, reporting to the British and the Germans, who were suspicious of each other and sometimes suspicious of him, and so forth. So he had a constant juggling act to follow, and he was very, very able at that, and also very able in small group corporate management type settings. As a mining engineer, he was on many boards, and he just dominated those boards. He was very quick and incisive, and just had that ability to manage people in the sense of human relations and so forth, and getting people to the finish line and getting something done. And part of what is important to Hoover was that accomplishment is what counts in life. He said that in a little autobiographical statement, that it wasn't just the incidentals of life. Is what you leave behind in the form of accomplishment is what really should make for your reputation. And he then said, Hoover, that the highest form of accomplishment is the origination and administration of institutions. And the first such institution for him was the Commission for Relief in Belgium. And then he administered a government agency that was created out of nothing, the Food Administration. And then in 1919, he administered an agency called the ARA, the American Relief Administration. That was a government agency while it lasted. And then on he went, one institution after another through his life. So he was always known as this fantastic organizer, also an extraordinarily hard worker. And someone said his recreation was work, and we might call him a workaholic, except that has a slightly negative connotation sometimes. Hoover enjoyed what he was doing. He drove himself. He had enough of physical energy and strength, basic attributes that would work well for him and these many challenges that he fed, that he led or dealt with. So I think that Hoover had many sort of God-given attributes, and he discovered those and then put them to good use. And he also had an ambition to succeed, as we discussed. And he also thought that he was probably doing one of the best things one could do with one's life, not only address the present, but leave an institution behind. So ultimately, he founded his Hoover Institution as an archive on World War I, and it grew into a premier think tank to this day, over 100 years later. And he headed the Boys Clubs movement as an ex-president for almost 30 years and built that institution up. So he just looked at life that way, that if you've got to solve problems and create networks and get people to work together and push toward an objective. And of course, he had the ability to lead people in that way. And it's helpful that the institutions he created often were of very noble nature. It wasn't simply a mining corporation out to make money for the shareholders, although there's nothing wrong with that. And that was a productive form of institution building. But he was a man who built institutions that were meant to improve and even save the lives of millions of people. And that gave him, I think, great prestige, and people admired his enormous commitment to that. So those are some of the factors that I think help to explain him.
George, I can't think of another human being who had such great accomplishments in his career, the first half of his career, and then has such an incredible turn of fortune. So let's now look at his pivot from being an administrative, I would call him a genius, an administrative genius, for being able to do all that he was able to do, contribute so much to the world in the philanthropic sector and in public service in the government sector. And then he pivots and decides to enter an Act Two, a political career. And he's going to get a very mixed record. So what went into his decision to leave this brilliant public service career. Well, politics is public service as well, but specifically as a politician, where he'd have to do the messy bit of campaigning and, raising money and things that he, for political purposes that he was not really used to. So what went into that decision?
Well, I think that he had it in mind that he might ultimately go for the presidency rather early. That is to say, 1918, 1919. He was in Washington, and it was one of the inner circle of Woodrow Wilson, and he was on the world stage in a spectacularly successful way. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist who knew Hoover, they met in 1919 and respected each other. Keynes, in a book that he wrote right after the war, said that Hoover was the only person at that Versailles tree making process in Paris in 1919, the only person who emerged from it with an enhanced reputation. So Hoover knew that many people wanted him to be president already. And here was a man, one of his great achievements or attributes, and a positive part of his resume was that he was not a politician. He was an outsider at a time when politicians were often looked upon as mediocrities, machine bosses, people with little imagination. And along comes Hoover, who accomplishes all these things, saves lives, helps win a war, helps make the peace, and so forth. So Hoover was very popular, particularly with college-educated people and housewives. Now, why housewives? Because as food administrator, he came up with a slogan, "Food will win the war." And there was some truth in that, in the sense that it was a tight squeeze for getting enough food in time to our beleaguered allies. And Hoover mobilized the American kitchen, the American housewives, with pledge cards where they said they put them on their window or by the stove or wherever and say, "I promise to abide by the rules that Herbert Hoover promulgates." And some of those rules where we got to save sugar, you don't eat meat on Monday, you don't eat wheat, meaning wheat products like bread, on Tuesday, and where you have these meatless days and so forth, and you conserve, or as the term had it, Hooverize. That became a term in our vocabulary, to Hooverize, to conserve particularly food. So many American women who were not largely in the workforce thought that they had had a part in winning the war, and Hoover had recognized them. So in 1920, when he first sort of ran for president, he had this great following among professional people, educated people, and particularly among housewives who felt that he had seen the role that they could play in the nation's life. He did not get the nomination in 1920. Warren Harding did, but amazingly, Hoover, who had served under Woodrow Wilson in a virtually cabinet level rank, became Harding's Secretary of Commerce. I don't know of any other American who served two successive administrations of opposite political coloration in succession like that. So Hoover became Secretary of Commerce and, as someone said, perhaps with a note of disparagement, undersecretary of every other department, because he's something of an empire builder as Secretary of Commerce, and some of his colleagues thought he was a little pushy and so forth. But that was sort of inside Washington politics. In the general population, Hoover was seen again as a great achiever. And then in 1927, and this is an important point, the great Mississippi River flood occurred, the greatest natural disaster in American history, at least to that point. Several 100,000 people in the lower Mississippi Valley were made homeless. And Hoover, because of his prior achievements as food relief humanitarian, was designated by Calvin Coolidge to be on a committee which he quickly headed of government cabinet secretaries to kind of oversee the massive relief operation in conjunction with the Red Cross. Well, this put Hoover back in the limelight more than ever as the great success story of earlier years. So by then he wanted to be president. I think because he looked upon the office as one that could both exemplify and refine the ideals of the American people. And he became a political philosopher along that way, publishing a little book in 1922 called American Individualism, in which he said that the real central focus of American self-expression, self-understanding is equality of opportunity. And remember, he was an orphan, a son of a blacksmith who had made it to the top. And he thought part of what made America so special was that it allowed people of whatever social status to rise to the level of whatever abilities they had. They were not frozen into a social class as they might have been in Europe at that time, for example, or in Asia. So he saw America as a land of opportunity and land that had done much for him. And he wanted, I think, in a very idealistic way, to give back. And he thought that he could bring about what I would call improvements. He saw himself as a kind of a progressive and then a progressive Republican, not progressive in the sense of wanting to restructure the whole apparatus of government or change the Constitution, something like that. That was not what he wanted, but he thought that he could perhaps bring people together, the private sector, the voluntary sector, the intermediate institutions, with government as a kind of catalyst and helper in certain ways, but not government as controller of all that effort. So he's in a sense trying to organize the altruistic energies of the American people. And he thought he could accomplish that as president. So he was amazingly successful in 28, won on a landslide, and people thought of him just about as a Superman, as this figure who could handle any crisis that might arise. He was a little nervous at the very start, just before he took office, because he realized that some of his enthusiastic supporters had sold him to the public as this master of emergencies. There was even a film that they put out about him that you can see on YouTube today called Herbert Hoover, Master of Emergencies. This was a kind of a campaign commercial or documentary of a sort that was meant obviously to help Hoover get elected president. So he came in on a wave of great expectations. And he confided once that he said, I have no fear of the ordinary work of the presidency. What I do worry about is that something will happen and the people will think that I can just snap my fingers, I'm paraphrasing him, and solve the problem. And then the public sentiment might turn on him. I don't think he had a premonition precisely that the stock market was going to crash and lead to a protracted depression, but he had that little sense that maybe his image was impossible to live up to, especially if there were some extraordinary strain that came upon the country. So that would be, I probably should stop at that point and amplify it further as you may wish, please.
No, it's fascinating because here's a man who's so accomplished, and then he's going to run smack into an economic downturn. So how does he, first of all, what is he like as a campaigner? Give us a little bit of a feel for that, for the messy side of politics that a lot of people don't really like to do. And then he starts off okay, but then with the stock market crash, and then a little bit of what seems like a recovery, but then it's starting to go down again. I mean, he has to ride this undulating depression and hope for recovery. So how does he handle all of that?
Well, in terms of the campaign in 1928, he was campaigning in a time of general prosperity, although not so much in the agricultural sector, which was substantial in those days. He was the beneficiary of what was sometimes called Coolidge prosperity. We were at peace as a nation, so the underlying conditions, many of them were favorable to continuity, and that would be an election of, in a sense, a third term for Coolidge republicanism, if you will. Now, Hoover was not a natural campaigner. He was very good in small group settings, very persuasive, but he tended to dislike public speaking, become a little more mechanical about it. When he gave speeches, he was not what you would call an orator. He didn't really care much for career politicians, but a number of them had hitched their wagons to his star. And so they went out and kind of organized the convention and rounded up the votes and so on. But he was distrusted by the party regulars. After all, he had worked for Woodrow Wilson, and that made him suspect. And there's more to that story. I won't digress. And the conservative wing, the Coolidge wing of the Republican Party, thought he was a bit too much of an engineer, maybe too much of a bureaucratic meddler type. That, in other words, he might be too much of a liberal or progressive Republican, whereas the progressive Republicans of the day thought he was too much of a shill for big business in their estimation. I think that was unfair. So he was distrusted by both the most progressive elements in the Republican Party, who were significant, and also the conservatives and the machine politicians. But he was very popular with the general public and among people who distrusted machine politicians, you see. So he got elected. He only gave 7 major speeches, and they were all very high statesman-like addresses. He conducted the campaign on a very high plane. Now, it wasn't the cleanest campaign in the sense that Al Smith, his opponent, was a Roman Catholic and a supporter of change in prohibition, and Hoover himself did not descend into the gutter and so on. But there were people on both sides who spread, what we might call politely disinformation about the respective candidates. So there was some bitterness at the grassroots, but Hoover tried to stay above that. Now, when the Depression, he was president for several months when things were going well. And he was getting used to the job. I think in that first year, he was a little uncomfortable being president, in the sense that he knew that there were plenty of people out there in the party who disliked him, distrusted him. He wasn't their type. He wasn't a glad-hander. He didn't like small talk. He didn't like to schmooze, with people. Time was important to him, and time was meant for accomplishment, you see. And of course, they looked upon him as this kind of naive outsider who looked down on them, you see. So there were his own party leaders, while they cooperated with him some, and he had some strong supporters among them, I should say. Nevertheless, there were pockets of suspicion. So he felt, I think, a little tentative in that first year of office. Now, in the fall, the crash comes. And Hoover had some worries that the stock market was artificially high, and that people had done some foolish things like borrow money to buy stocks. And when the stocks are going up and up, things look great. But then when the stocks crashed, a lot of people were left high and dry. So Hoover saw his job at that point to kind of reassure the public that this Wall Street debacle was confined to Wall Street. It's an adjustment. We've had crashes in American history, had crashes in American history a number of times, and there was a time of pain and retrenchment, but people got over it. The economy recovered. And Hoover tried to rally the nation on those terms. And he quickly sensed that the psychology was important in all of this. And he realized rather quickly that the public was rattled. And so he took various steps to try to ensure continuity. He got the big business leaders to say that they would not drastically cut wages. He got labor leaders to promise they wouldn't engage in strikes and so forth, and waste resources that way. And he also believed that the government should spend more money on public works as a way of employing people and kind of getting us through this temporary trough. And I should say, at that point, I'm speaking now the fall of 29 into the middle of 1930, in the first few months after the crash, many people applauded Hoover's leadership at that point. He was highly praised for the way he had rallied leaders of business and other classes to come together. And the stock market actually rebounded a good deal in the early months of 1930. And then he went out on a limb, and he was not alone in doing this, I have to stress. He went out on a limb and said that he thought that the worst would be over in 60 days. And he said that in March of 1930. And then when 60 days passed, he said basically he thought that we had turned the corner. He never said prosperity is just around the corner. That's a quotation sometimes attributed to him. He never said it, but he said something that in essence indicated much the same thing, that he thought that the return to normal prosperity was not far off. But things got worse, and there were many reasons for that. And so eventually his reputation as a wonder worker began to look tarnished. After all, we the American people elected Hoover, this master of efficiency, this great organizer of energy of the public. And why aren't things getting better? And as I have argued in lectures and in my writings, things began to happen that would undercut Hoover just when it seemed like things were turning around. And the first great shock, other than the crash itself, was the drought of 1930. This was, Gleaves, the worst drought in American history, at least up to that time. I think 25 states, roughly half of all the lower 48 states, were affected by a drought that literally destroyed the crops of millions of acres. And farm income, and remember, this is a time when close to half the nation's workforce, 40% or so, were farmers. So the farm income dropped by 25%. Now, Hoover couldn't be blamed for the drought. But as time went by, people said that the relief work that he organized through getting people to contribute money to the Red Cross, and in particular, the Red Cross was used to distribute food in Arkansas and elsewhere where the need was greatest. It didn't seem to be working, and so his reputation as a humanitarian came to be tarnished somewhat, sadly. And you might ask, one might ask, well, why did he do so much for Europe when they were in need, and why didn't he do so much for the United States? Well, I think there are two fundamental reasons to that question. First, in contrast to Europe as he witnessed it in and after World War I, the United States had a network of local relief and charity through United Way and Red Cross and state and local and non-governmental organization. We were a society that had believed in self-help and mutual support. We didn't need the government at the federal level to come in and do it for us. And in fact, that was essentially unprecedented. The federal government simply did not get into that role. And so that's one reason. He thought that in contrast with Europe, the United States had the resources to do it. So I think that was really the fundamental reason. He also was, I think, fearful that if we relied too much on the federal government, it would create what we today would call a culture of pause briefly, just recover. I think at that time, Hoover was afraid that if the federal government intervened, as we have become accustomed 100 years later almost, that it would create what we would today call a culture of dependency, a welfare class, a dependent class, undermining the resourcefulness and initiative of the people at the grassroots. So, and that we might institute what was pejoratively called in 1930 a dole, and just a handout of food or money even to the unemployed. So we had no system of unemployment relief as it's come to exist at that time. And Hoover was very concerned that the traditional American system would be fatally undermined if we just started spending, or if the federal government just started spending money, like some of the more advanced progressives were arguing by that point. It would undermine some of the most precious ideals and heritage of the American people. So that limited his approach, but he thought that that approach was sufficient. Well, as time went by, and there are many stages in this that I can elaborate on if you care to have me do so, there are times when it seemed like Hoover had indeed stabilized things and when the country was on its way back. Another great moment of downward change came in the spring, summer, and fall of 1931 because of European financial dislocations. Dislocations that affected us because many American banks had poured a great deal of money into Germany and other countries to help those countries recover. Those loans to Europe were now at risk. So if the Germans defaulted and came close to doing that, this would negatively impact American banks and thus spread the pain throughout the American economy. So Hoover saw himself as having kind of reached a plateau. It seemed that the economy was starting to improve. And then comes the next wave of trouble. And it overwhelms the United States, particularly in the fall of 31, with hundreds and hundreds of American banks failing. And again, just for the listeners who might not know this, there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation at that time. That did not come into existence until after Hoover left the White House. So it was a very different world in which he operated. And the longer he struggled at it, and he struggled manfully and with great resourcefulness, and had many competent people assisting him, and yet the economy didn't seem to stay improved. And so people began to turn bitterly against him and blame him for the depression. It became a very personal blame game that they played. And so that worry that he had in 1929 that the public might find that he was not the all-saving figure that they had thought he was, that would redound negatively. And indeed that happened.
You know, George, as I've heard you over the years speak about Hoover, you advance a thesis that I think is really compelling about the nature of the money supply during the Great Depression. And so anybody who would have been in office would have met with just Herculean task of bringing this economy or righting the ship. Would you go a little bit into the idea of the money supply?
Yes, well, the nation's legal guardian of the money supply was the Federal Reserve Board, which is a new institution. It had only been founded in 1914, so it didn't have a great track record to build upon particularly. And the Federal Reserve, it is now believed, especially by those who have been persuaded by Milton Friedman and his writings on the monetary history of the United States with his colleague Anna Schwartz, and more recently by the leading historian of the Federal Reserve, Alan Meltzer, the late Alan Meltzer. And they all argue that the Federal Reserve fatally mismanaged the money supply as part of the response to the Great Depression. Now, there are many reasons, structural and intellectual, why the Federal Reserve Board misunderstood, misconceived, or simply was passive or incapable of rapid action because of bureaucratic rivalries and tensions within, et cetera. So during the period 1929 from the crash until the time Hoover left office, the money supply of the United States, the total supply of money out there, declined by about 1/3. We had a massive, unprecedented deflation. And the Fed seemed incapable of turning that around. They tried once or twice with what were called open market purchasing operations that were designed to give greater liquidity to the banks and stabilize the banks and so forth. But they didn't persist in it, and some of the Fed leaders didn't believe in it. But the most famous incident of the episode of this was from March to August of 1932, while Hoover was still president in an election year. And basically for about 10 weeks, the Fed pursued a policy of what we might call quantitative easing in today's jargon. And they did that partly because they were afraid that the Congress was going to be overrun by inflationary sentiment and would pass a law forcing the Fed to change the money supply to a point that would make the price level go back to the middle of the 20s. And they thought that was insane. So to head off the Congress from doing something drastically stupid, in their view, the Fed had this kind of slow motion measured policy designed to improve things, but not have runaway inflation. Well, as soon as Congress adjourned in July, the Fed stopped that policy. Well, the monetarists in the economics world, the followers of Friedman and such, have argued, and Friedman himself argued that that 10 weeks actually led to some improvement in the economy. The economy bottomed out in July. The stock market staged a significant rally in the next 3 months, and various other indices of economic activity modestly improved. And Hoover even campaigned in the fall of 32 against Roosevelt for re-election, and arguing that about 1 million men had gone back to work from the summer into the fall. So he said, that we changed. We're back on the right course. And he said, my policies have brought this about. And it didn't last. It went down again. And of course, it went to a catastrophic denouement in the last days of Hoover's administration with the massive national banking closures, and the economy seemed to hit rock bottom. So Hoover had an explanation for that. He said, well, that was brought about by fear in the investor class that Roosevelt was going to come in and do funny money, gimmickry, go off the gold standard, spend a load of money, bring us into an inflationary upward spiral, and really mismanage things. And there is something to be said for that, because some of the international monetary players did fear that Roosevelt was going to go into uncharted radical territory. And you have to remember too, historically, the Democrats were known as the party of easy money. And this goes back to William Jennings Bryan and his crusade against the gold standard in 1896. So the Democrats had to overcome that reputation. And Hoover said, well, if you elect the Democrats, that's what you're going to get again. So, but the monetarists are now saying, and I find this very plausible, that what happened was they stopped their open market purchasing plan too soon. If they had gone on and just made it go forward longer, that really would have had a transformative impact, or at least a much more measurable positive impact on the economy and unemployment and so forth. So it might be that a lot of what Hoover did, all of the motion that he went through, all this hard work and setting up committees and exhorting the American people and campaigns to stop people from hoarding their money in their homes, all that activity may have not so much right or wrong. And the liberals say it was wrong, and some of people on the right say that he did too much, and he was too much the meddler and paving the way to FBR. So I think that maybe one might have to say that it wasn't that what he did was so much right or wrong as irrelevant to the underlying problem that nobody quite understood at that time, namely the centrality of the control of the money supply as an ingredient in economic prosperity. The Fed had some inkling. There were a few outliers who didn't have much popularity, who thought that maybe this is the key to the puzzle, but that really didn't become more mainstream thinking until after Friedman wrote his book, 30 years later. So Hoover gets criticized even now from the left as this kind of pro-gold standard fiscal hawk who didn't want to spend much money, and he should have been Keynesian. That was his fault. He wasn't Keynesian enough. And then on the right, there are people who say, well, he pursued the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was a bad thing. And he did other things that worsened the economy and also paved the way for even more grandiose government intervention in the economy. So Hoover, that argument would say, did too much. And the perspective that I think should be considered more is that neither of those tells the whole story. Neither of those antithetical interpretations of Hoover that have long been, dominant in the scholarship or prominent in the scholarship. Neither one of those, I think, is sufficient. And we might want to look more carefully as historians at what the economists have found, namely that the Federal Reserve, for a host of reasons, permitted, partly by passivity, partly by simply having sort of doctrinal mistakes in their heads, they pursued policies that made what Milton Friedman called a garden variety recession into a catastrophic Great Depression. We have to know that the Great Depression wasn't called the Great Depression, in October 29, it was the slump. And then Hoover started using the word depression with a small d, it's kind of downward, turning. But as time went by, people realized that this was, something remarkable and in need of explanation. It wasn't just a cyclical phenomenon. It was something far worse. And so what we now know is that the Federal Reserve mismanaged things on a grand scale without anyone quite realizing that their policies were as crucial as we now would tend to think. So now our Fed is much more proactive, or it tries to be in going against inflation or alternatively against depressionary fears. And but still, the people who administer the Fed are people, and so people are fallible. And so we still have great debates to this day as to the wisdom of what the Fed is doing. So I think that if you look at Hoover from the perspective of how the Fed made his problems maybe more protracted and far worse, you have to be a little more forgiving of Hoover and not simply say, well, he didn't do it right or he didn't do enough. There's been too much, I think, Hoover-centric interpretation of the Great Depression. And we need to look at that broader picture. And that doesn't mean that we would necessarily find that Hoover was right on every policy. And as a historian, I'm not here to say that he was, but it helps to understand I hope it helps us to understand the complexity of the situation. And I think that's what historians ought to be aiming for, so that we avoid a sort of soundbite certitudes, just sort of quick, superficial bits and pieces of what is supposed to be wisdom, but might be really rather shallow. So as a historian, I try to work against shallow interpretations and help people hopefully understand the complexity of the record, which usually means that it's not all black and all white one way or the other.
Once Hoover ran for election and then lost to a very talented campaigner, a very charismatic politician in Franklin Roosevelt. He went on the offensive. He did not let up in his critique of President Roosevelt, his New Deal approach, and then went on to critique, statism, totalitarianism, became quite an elder statesman in yet another act in his public life that people don't know about. I mean, everybody just dumps on Hoover for his years as president, and they don't understand the richness of the years before the presidency and his elder statesmanship after the presidency. Could you just say a few words about the nature of his critique of what was happening in American politics, the growing statism and that sort of thing after Roosevelt came into office, and then even after that?
Yes. Well, Hoover lived for 4 years as president, and then more than a third of his life was as ex-president, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation. And before he was president, he had this enormous record on the public scene. So there are vast features of Hoover's life that have been almost blotted out because of the fixation on the White House. And obviously the White House was a pinnacle, not the only one, of his career, and that is not to be ignored. But Hoover did not go quietly into exile, as it were. He stayed quiet for about a year and gave Roosevelt a chance, and then Hoover came out in 1934 with a book called The Challenge to Liberty. And Hoover argued that historic liberalism was really a way of explaining or describing the historic American philosophy that he associated with. And he said the trouble was that collectivism was on the rise. Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy, socialism in parts of Europe, communism, and so on, and what he called regimentation at home. And that was his word for the New Deal. I don't think he even used the word New Deal in that book, or if he did, it was just in a minor way. So he argued that the Roosevelt lurch in 1933 was a lurch to the left that was going to involve the government in a more massive intervention in American life and undermine the traditional American institutions outside of government. And he had a marvelous phrase or two to describe his conception of America at its best. He said that people engaged in self-government outside of government. So he was not a small government man exactly. I mean, he was a progressive Republican in his earlier phase, but he began to realize that the New Deal had outflanked that so far to the left that, as he put it in a letter, historic liberalism is now conservatism in contrast. So I think at around 1937 or so, Hoover realized that as a historic liberal, favoring energetic but limited government and reliance upon the private sector and avoidance of government as owner or manager of the economy. Regulator to some extent, but not manager, you see. He made that distinction. He said, if you look at things that way, historic liberalism is now a kind of conservatism. So he became this sort of grandfather figure of the American right. And of course, a leading and very articulate critic of what he saw the collectivist tendencies of the New Deal. Far too much government intervention. And then, of course, the attack on the courts was something that greatly vexed Hoover. And he thought also that the New Deal, by bringing in government relief programs that might be necessary in a certain immediate sense because of the magnitude of unemployment and forms of deprivation that people were suffering from. Nevertheless, he said, if you turn that way and politicize it, as he saw the Roosevelt administration doing, he said, you're going to create a kind of a monster of corruption and so on. And that became another part of his critique. And he also felt that there was too much centralization of power in the executive under Roosevelt. And so he argued for the Congress to take more control. So Hoover indulged in what he called, engaged in what he himself called a crusade against collectivism. And he inveighed against what he called totalitarian liberals who thought you could somehow have a free society, but an economy that is controlled by the government. He sounded a bit like Friedrich Hayek, the economist, Austrian economist who wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944. And Hoover and Hayek actually met on one occasion after the war. I wish I knew more about that relationship, but they did have an acquaintance. And you can see certain parallels there. Hayek was not an ultra-libertarian at that point, neither was Hoover, but both thought that the government had expanded far too much and was setting Europe and the United States on the road to what Hayek called serfdom, or basically a population that is passive and manipulated and managed by bureaucratic elites that are not accountable to popular control. So Hoover became a Taft Republican in 1952. He was for Goldwater in 64. Hoover died before the election, but he was very much seen as the grand old man, the man who had kept the faith, even though he would never get renominated, although he wanted to be in 1940 in particular. He wanted to come back that way, but when that didn't happen, he devoted himself, in addition to his humanitarian philanthropic work, he devoted himself to being a kind of philosopher statesman, which brought him into conflict repeatedly with what he saw as the excesses of the New Deal. So Hoover made quite a reputation for himself, and in his later life, and people on the Republican right in particular, Midwestern Taft Republicans and such, thought of Hoover as a heroic figure. And part of what made such people like him was that he didn't go quietly. He fought back. And he became, I would say, Roosevelt's most formidable critic in the political arena. And I think Roosevelt realized that Hoover was damaged goods as far as ever getting reelected. But I think Roosevelt respected Hoover's mind and thought that Hoover was a rather formidable foe in some ways, even though Hoover could not win back enough popular support to get a nomination or run again for president. So I think part of the Hoover story that I have found most interesting is this long period when he did not go and accept defeat and repudiation at the polls and just go off and disappear from public view. Part of what drove him in those later years, we talked about his drive for achievement earlier on in this conversation. Part of it was his drive for vindication, but not only personal vindication, but because he really believed that the alternative he proposed was essential to the well-being and survival of a free country. So he really thought that the stakes were that high. And if I may put it in just this way as well, we've had a debate, I would say, Gleaves, for over 100 years in American history between the advocates of, I'll say, a free market system and the advocates of government regulation of one or another degree. Which is the problem? Is the free market the problem and government regulation the solution? Or is government the problem and deregulation perhaps the solution? So it's a kind of a perpetual debate that defines our politics to some degree ever since, I would say, the 1890s. And Hoover and Roosevelt both sensed that they were playing for high stakes. As we would say in our terminology, it was a battle of the narratives. And Hoover, I think, unusually among Republicans of his day and among conservatives, sensed the great importance of having a properly understood account of what happened in the Great Depression and its aftermath. And so he spent a great deal of time in later years explaining what he did and what he thought were the failures and excesses of his opponents. So this battle of narratives, I would say, continues. And Hoover saw this as a prophet in 1932, and I'll just end this answer to you on this point. In 1932, he gave a speech in Madison Square Garden just before the election of 32. And he said, this is a contest, not a contest, more than a contest between two men or two parties. It's a contest of political philosophies. And he said, the outcome of this election will determine the course of American history for a century to come. And he later said he thought that was one of the most prophetic utterances he ever made. And I think he's got a point that really defined the way we have organized our politics in terms of at least the economy ever since. Which is the problem, which is the solution. And Hoover became, by his very persistence, a kind of heroic figure. One might not agree with him, but one had to at least express, or rather admire his and respect his commitment to his viewpoint. So I think you can read some of those speeches that Hoover gave in the 1930s against Roosevelt's policies, and you could say we're off, he's practically talking about today's events in some ways. You could easily read those speeches and see resonance in our own current politics. So Hoover, in that way, is not a forgotten figure. He is someone who is still relevant, if not always studied adequately, still relevant to the life of the American people.
Well, here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, we are certainly interested in this incredible story, this unknown story. We've given his story such short shrift. The fact that he was a political philosopher of some note is a remarkable thing that has just lapsed from American memory. So those are insightful, powerful words on which to close, George. Dr. George Nash, thank you for being our very thoughtful guest today. You know, here at the Ford, we seek a more perfect union by inspiring the better angels of our nature. And George, your scholarly work helps us better understand the country we love, and you help us see a productive path forward in your work on Hoover, post-war conservative movement, a book, by the way, that I was just looking into while you were speaking. This is really your chief work for which you're known. And you also, of course, are a very recent and welcome addition to being a senior fellow here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, for which we're so grateful. And as for our friends of Ford's, George's work, let me speak to you now for a minute. George's work sheds new light on the importance of understanding American culture and leadership and politics and the ebbs and flows of people's destinies and parties' destinies, movements' destinies. It's the focus of our new initiative at the Ford Leadership Forum to raise a new generation of leaders up who can understand these things and articulate the battle of ideas that is around them. We'll want to bring George back to Grand Rapids when his busy schedule allows, because there's much, much more to learn from him. From the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, this is Gleaves Whitney, exploring the question.